Welcome back to the Grenke Chess Festival 2026 Freestyle Open A, and Round 2 delivered fireworks across the board. Out of 68 games, 57 were decisive, meaning draws were the exception today. At the top of the standings, Magnus Carlsen, Ian Nepomniachtchi, Hans Niemann, Vincent Kayama, Jan Krzysztof Duda, Nihal Sarin, Vladimir Fedosiev, Aravind Chithambaram, Alexei Sarana, and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave all sit on a perfect 2 out of 2. The race for first place is wide open, but one game stood out above all others. Alua Nurman, rated 24-43, is a rising Kazakhstani talent stepping into one of the most daunting matchups imaginable. On the other side sits Magnus Carlsen, rated 28-88 and widely regarded as the greatest chess player who has ever lived. Magnus brings his trademark in game mastery and relentless positional grinding to every game. For Nurman, this was a chance to test herself against the best. For Carlsen, it was business as usual. This is freestyle chess, also known as chess 960 or Fischer random, meaning the pieces behind the pawns are shuffled into a random starting position. The opening phase here is less about memorized theory and more about rapid development and piece coordination. Famous grandmasters like Hikaru Nakamura and Magnus Carlsen himself have been vocal advocates of the format, praising how it forces pure chess thinking from the very first move. White opens with the c-pawn, immediately staking a claim in the center and angling for a flexible freestyle setup. In this format, central space is at a premium since neither side can lean on memorized preparation. Carlsen responds with a fianchetto idea, preparing to develop the bishop to g7 and control the long diagonal. This is a solid, classical approach that works in virtually any opening structure. White mirrors the idea, also setting up a kingside fianchetto. Both sides are now committed to a symmetrical diagonal battle, which promises a rich strategic middle game. Black solidifies the center with d6, a flexible move that supports a future e5 push while keeping the position solid and avoiding any early tactical complications. White keeps the structure restrained with d3, choosing a King's Indian attack-style setup rather than fighting for the center immediately. This is a safe, solid approach that many players use in unfamiliar positions. An interesting and provocative bishop development, placing the piece on c6, where it eyes the long diagonal and puts pressure on any future e4 advance by White. Carlsen is already thinking about piece activity from the very start. White pushes forward in the center, but this is the first significant decision point of the game. The engine flags this as a swing of over half a pawn in Black's favor. By advancing the e-pawn here, White places it on a square where the bishop on c6 can immediately exert pressure and the structure becomes slightly overextended. A more cautious approach, keeping the position compact, would have served White better. Carlsen retreats the bishop to d7, a pragmatic recalibration. The engine sees this as giving back some of the advantage, but Black is simply consolidating and keeping the position healthy. Sometimes the best move is the one that causes no harm. White develops the bishop to c3, pointing it toward the kingside and supporting the e4 pawn. Development continues smoothly, and both sides are still in early maneuvering territory. Black strikes on the queenside with c5, claiming central space and challenging White's c4 pawn. The engine notes another evaluation nudge in Black's favor, as this pawn advance gives Carlsen a territorial foothold. White captures the bishop on h8, trading a developed piece for a rook that had not yet entered the game. In freestyle chess, the piece configuration on the back rank means this kind of early trade can be acceptable, but White is essentially handing Black the initiative in the exchange. Black recaptures with the rook, activating it immediately. The evaluation holds steady, and Carlsen has a fully functional position with strong central pawns and active piece potential. White delivers a check with the queen, forcing the Black king to move. This looks aggressive, but it is somewhat superficial since the queen on h6 can become misplaced after Black responds calmly. The king steps to g8, perfectly safe and already tucked away. Black loses no tempo here, and the queen on h6 is left looking a bit out of place. White brings the knight toward the center, developing naturally and supporting the e4 point. The position remains roughly balanced as both sides complete their development. Black develops a knight to c6, a natural square where it bears down on d4 and e5. Carlsen is coordinating his pieces methodically, building pressure without any rush. White plants a knight on the powerful d5 outpost, a thematic idea in many double-pawn structures. This looks imposing, but requires careful follow-up to justify the piece's position. Black immediately challenges the d5 knight, by landing on e6, a strong centralization that also eyes the d4 square. The engine notes a swing here as the pressure on white's knight begins to tell. White reinforces the center with the second knight coming to c3. Maintaining coordination, both knights now support each other across the central files. Carlsen retreats the queen to f8, a calm defensive move that also gets the queen out of any potential tactical lines. The engine sees this as improving black's coordination slightly. White repositions the queen to d2, connecting the rooks and stepping away from any potential threats on the h-file. A sensible housekeeping move. Black places a knight on the powerful d4 outpost, deep in white's half of the board. This knight is extremely well placed, applying pressure and restricting white's options significantly. White castles kingside, finally securing the king. The position is still manageable, but black's knight on d4 looms large over the entire board. Carlsen advances the h-pawn, beginning a slow but purposeful kingside expansion. This is a long-term strategic commitment that will eventually create space or force weaknesses in white's kingside structure. White meets the pawn advance in kind, attempting to lock the kingside rather than allow black free expansion. The pawn tension along the h-file will become a key feature of the position. A sharp move, placing the bishop on h3, where it immediately targets the white king's cover and eyes the g2 square. This creates a real threat and forces white to react carefully. White plays the bishop to g2, defending the kingside and blocking the black bishop's diagonal. This is a logical response, but Carlsen's light square bishop remains a long-term asset even after the exchange that follows. Black advances the e-pawn to e6, challenging white's centralized d5 knight. This is a thematic reaction that gains space and prepares to push white's pieces back. The knight retreats to e3. Maintaining its central presence and keeping an eye on d5 and f5, white is maneuvering defensively but staying in the game. Carlsen takes the bishop on g2, simplifying and opening the king slightly. The exchange is principled since black removes an important defensive piece from white's kingside. White recaptures with the king, bringing it closer to the center. In many in-game scenarios this would be desirable, but here it slightly exposes the white king to future activity. Black plays i6, a quiet but useful move that prepares the b5 pawn advance. Carlsen is building his queenside counterplay methodically. White launches the f-pawn forward, trying to create kingside activity and open lines for the rooks. This is an ambitious attempt to seize the initiative before black's queenside play becomes too powerful. Carlsen advances b5 without hesitation, striking on the queenside just as white committed to the kingside. Both sides are now racing to create threats on their respective flanks. White plays b3, trying to shore up the queenside and prevent black from advancing further. The evaluation begins to tip toward black, as this move does not generate active counterplay. Black pushes b4 immediately, gaining space and beginning to squeeze white's queenside structure. The pawn chain is now advancing with momentum. White moves the knight to i4, which the engine flags as a significant error, swinging the evaluation by nearly a full pawn in black's favor. The knight on i4 is a passive piece, sitting on the rim with limited impact. Keeping the knight centralized or finding a more active square would have kept the position more tenable. From here, black's advantage begins to solidify into something real. Black advances the a-pawn to i5, and the engine marks this as a mistake, though the evaluation swing of over 2 pawns reflects how complicated the position has become rather than a blunder in the traditional sense. Carlsen is pressing, but the engine suggests an alternative approach would have been even more decisive. The queenside pawns are marching forward regardless. White doubles rooks toward the f-file, preparing to contest the kingside. The rook lift is a logical response to the position, trying to generate some activity before black's queenside rolls through. Black retreats the queen to g7, a move the engine flags as inaccurate given the position. A more direct approach maintaining pressure would have been preferred, but Carlsen is still clearly better and continues to press the position. White doubles both rooks on the f-file, maximizing pressure on f5 and f7. This is white's best chance to generate counterplay and keep the game complicated. Black brings the rook to d8, activating it along the d-file. The engine notes this as slightly imprecise given the alternatives, but Carlsen keeps all the important pieces in the game. White tucks the king away to h1, stepping out of any potential checks along the g-file, a sensible safety measure before engaging further. Black moves the king to h7, also repositioning for safety. Both kings are finding safer homes as the tension increases across the board. White repositions the rook to h2, shifting focus to the h-file and preparing to support a possible h5 advance. The rook shuffle continues as both sides maneuver. Black repositions the knight to e7, regrouping. The engine marks this as imprecise, preferring a more active continuation, but Carlsen is keeping his pieces flexible and his advantage remains substantial. White centralizes the queen to g2, connecting to the rook on h2 and keeping the kingside under observation. The queen is well placed here, but there is not enough activity to threaten black meaningfully. The knight retreats to g8, another regrouping move that the engine flags as slightly inaccurate. Carlsen is navigating a complex position with multiple plans available, and even imprecise moves leave him clearly on top. White launches the g-pawn forward, trying to blow open the kingside with a pawn storm. This is a double-edged decision that creates chances, but also leaves the kingside somewhat vulnerable. Black captures on g4, accepting the pawn and opening the h-file. The engine sees this as slightly imprecise, but it is entirely playable, and black's material advantage is now growing. White advances the h-pawn to h5, pushing toward black's king with the passer in mind. The engine awards this as keeping the position tense, though black retains a clear edge. Black strikes back with f5, a powerful central break that challenges white's e4 pawn and opens lines toward the white king. The evaluation shifts in black's favor as this move generates immediate threats. White recaptures the pawn with the knight on g4, maintaining some kingside presence and keeping the h5 pawn advanced. The knight is active here, but black's central pawns are becoming a formidable force. The knight returns to e7, and again the engine sees this as slightly imprecise given the alternatives. Even so, Carlsen's position is winning at this point, and the exact route matters less than the destination. White pushes the h-pawn all the way to h6, creating a dangerous passed pawn deep in black's territory. This is white's best practical chance, creating a concrete threat that must be addressed. Black retreats the queen to f8, defending against the h6 threat while keeping the queen active. The engine notes this is not the most precise response, but Carlsen remains comfortably ahead. White repositions the knight back to e3, defending and regrouping. The knight was well placed on g4, but needed to return to support the center and defend key squares. Black activates the queen to f6, a more aggressive square where it bears down on the white king's position and targets the e5 and d4 squares. The engine shows another large swing in black's favor as this move increases the pressure significantly. White shifts the queen to g3, maintaining coordination between queen and rook while keeping an eye on the kingside. White is doing everything possible to stay in the game, but the position is slipping away. The knight swings to c6, once again centralizing and pressuring white's position from multiple directions. The engine sees another favorable evaluation shift for black as the knight adds to the chorus of attacking pieces. White repositions the rook to g1, trying to contest the g-file and generate counterplay. The rook is doing useful work here, but white's position is now seriously compromised. Black swings the rook to g8, seizing the g-file and creating immediate pressure against the white king. The engine marks this as a significant swing in black's favor, and Carlsen's pieces are now dominating every file and diagonal. White retreats the knight to b2, stepping away from the queen side and regrouping. The knight is doing little from here, and black now has complete control of the g-file. Black doubles rooks on the f-file, building maximum pressure on f4 and preparing to invade. With both rooks centralized and the queenside pawns still advancing, white is being squeezed from every direction. White attempts to contest the f-file by repositioning the rook to f1. The engine sees this as an inaccuracy given the options available, swinging the evaluation further toward black. Black advances the g-pawn to g5, and the engine marks this as a mistake with a massive evaluation swing. Despite the large number, Carlsen is still winning. The pawn advance creates a passed pawn, but also allows white some practical counterplay that a cleaner continuation would have avoided. White captures on g5 with the f-pawn, obliging and opening the f-file in the process. This gives white some activity, but Carlsen's material and positional advantage remains overwhelming. Black recaptures with the queen on g5, maintaining the material count and keeping the queen highly active. The engine once again flags this as imprecise, but with an advantage of over 3 pawns, Carlsen can afford some imprecision. White takes the opportunity to trade queens on g5, hoping that simplification will ease the defensive burden, but trading into a rook and knight in game where black has the extra pawn and the more active pieces is not a salvation for white. Black recaptures on g5 with the rook, and the engine notes another large swing as the rook becomes tremendously active. The position is a technically won in game for Carlsen at this point. White captures on f5 with the e-pawn, trying to simplify the pawn structure and eliminate black's central passed pawns. Every trade helps white reduce the material on the board, but black's winning advantage is not going anywhere. Black recaptures with the knight on f5, centralizing the piece with tempo. The engine shows another large swing, confirming that the technical phase is well in hand for Carlsen. White exchanges knights on f5, forcing the trade and trying to eliminate black's active pieces. The endgame ahead is still losing for white, but at least the material is being reduced. Black recaptures with the f-rook, keeping both rooks active and the pressure intact. The engine marks this as another swing in black's favor, as white has no way to fight the 2 active rooks. White captures on f5 with the rook, simplifying further. Each exchange reduces white's suffering, but does not change the fundamental outcome. Black recaptures on f5 with the e-pawn, creating a passed pawn. The engine confirms yet another large swing as this passer, combined with black's active rook, gives a technically won position. White retreats the knight to d1, trying to regroup and find a defensive setup. The knight is heading toward f2 or e3 to try to blockade black's advancing pawns. Black places the knight on d4, an excellent central outpost from which it controls multiple important squares. The engine marks this as another winning level swing for Carlsen. White repositions the rook to h3, activating it along the 3rd rank and targeting black's passed pawns. White is fighting with everything available, but the position is objectively lost. Black centralizes the rook to g6, and the engine sees this as slightly imprecise but enormously strong regardless. The rook on g6 supports the advancing pawns and controls the g-file. White repositions the rook to e3, trying to create counterplay and target black's queenside pawns. This is a resourceful defensive try but ultimately insufficient. The king captures the h6 pawn, removing it from the board and simplifying. The engine marks this as another large swing in black's favor. By walking the king forward, Carlsen accepts slight risks but gains a material pawn and activates the king for the endgame. White activates the knight to f2, bringing it back into play and threatening to target black's passed pawns. This is a practical attempt to complicate the position and make black work for the win. Black plants the rook on e6, and the engine registers another massive favorable swing. The rook on e6 is excellently placed, both attacking and defending key squares while supporting the king's advance. White captures on e6 with check, forcing a rook exchange and trying to trade down to a theoretically more drawable endgame. Desperation is setting in, but there is no way to avoid the material deficit. Black recaptures with the knight on e6, and the engine marks this as another strong winning move. The knight on e6 is a dominant piece, controlling key squares and perfectly coordinated with the remaining pawns. White activates the king to g2, trying to centralize and create some defensive activity. In a lost in-game, king activity is all that is left to try. The knight hops to d4, and the engine confirms another winning level swing. The knight on d4 is a monster, controlling the center and restricting the white knight completely. At this point, Nurman resigns shortly after, recognizing that the position is completely beyond saving. This game was ultimately decided by Carlsen's superior piece coordination and his relentless exploitation of the queenside pawn advance. The critical phase came in the late middle game when white's queenside became overextended and the knight on d4 became an unstoppable central force. Nurman fought bravely against an opponent rated nearly 450 points above her, but class and technique told in the end. That wraps up our Round 2 coverage of the Grenke Chess Festival 2026 Freestyle Open A. With an enormous 10 players tied at the top on 2 out of 2, every game in Round 3 will have massive implications for the standings. Who will break away from the pack? Let us know in the comments who you think will emerge at the top, and make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single move.